We have traveled all the way to America in order to examine what's really going on with the American culture. And it's an honor for us to have you with us, Mr. Woodley Auguste.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here on the Herland Report.
What we hear in Europe regarding the United States really much comes out of CNN. CNN defines everything. They define who we're supposed to hate, who we're supposed to love, and man, do they go on and on about things that really are not that important in the world. We should be more occupied with thinking about finding peace and respecting each other and respecting national sovereignty and each culture's right to own and determine their own nation and what kind of values they would like to have in their nation. My question for you really, as Europeans, we're wondering about that. The US used to be such a country that respected different nationalities, but today it seems like the US really is all about anger and hatred between groups. How did this all happen?
I think that what's taken place, Hannah, is that we've seen in just the past 10 years a real pivot from the values of American exceptionalism, many of those things that have been integrated into society, where we once thought we've arrived at the pinnacle of post-racism, where we now have a black president, President Obama, and that there was going to somehow become a utopia. And we've all realized, as they say here in the United States, the emperor has no clothes. It's a fallacy. There are many problems that are present, and now people are much more cognizant of that because, unfortunately, those problems are beginning to surface all the more where there's a level of unrest and distrust for not just political office, but also the media, the things that we're hearing where there is a lack, there is a political correctness that's exemplified where it's taboo to say and speak truth.
It's a strange thing, actually, because as you state, it's been a development over the past few years where it seems to me that ethnicity becomes the issue instead of national identity.
Well, correct. It certainly is that. It's no longer I'm an American, but I'm an American of insert whatever your racial makeup is. And that is where the problem is, I think, because we no longer approach things as citizens of our country, but we say, well, we're different. And because I'm different, I don't agree with whoever. So in this instance, you would say, I'm black, I'm a person of color, my parents are from Haiti. So therefore, I cannot agree with someone who's white because we have a divergence of opinion. But at the core, we all want basically the same things. We want to take opportunities, we want to take care of our families, provide for them in ways where they can be successful and position them to establish the quote-unquote the American dream.
I find that very interesting because, as you know, I was born and raised in Africa, and I really identify with the African, culture in many ways. Especially then Kenya and Congo, where I came from. And what I find so interesting with you is really you have that international perspective that we're looking for, because you're originally from Haiti, then your parents came to the United States, so you're able to analyze both cultures. And I think that's what many Americans lack. We see it's a problem in the US. There's no national newspaper. The media here doesn't focus on really telling people in a respectful way about the outside world.
No, it's much of it is just noise. It's chatter from commentators with limited views. And I think what's taken place is a lack of critical thinking, where there's very little critical analysis. Growing up, being in a household with more than one culture, you had divergence of opinions where you would have what was happening outside with my American friends, but when I came home, it was vastly different, where Haitian culture, which is very similar to African culture, it permeates throughout, so our worldview is vastly different. And I think that impacts the way you see the world, where we didn't look at it as, oh, the whites are suppressing you. You look at it as, it doesn't matter. We came here to this country to do something with ourselves. So we're going to do it regardless of what. There's nothing going to get in the way of creating something lasting for the next generation. And it was always viewed generationally, not just limited to just me, but My uncle made sure that that was embedded to constantly think of the next group coming up. So my children or my children's children.
And that's one of the things I've said all the way over in Europe and Scandinavia for many, many years, that Europe has a lot to learn from the African communities, how to take care of the elderly, how to, take care of the family, how to respect the father in the family, how to get that kind of order or that collectivistic view on things, to take care of the solidarity in society, which we see is rampantly falling apart in Europe as egoism and extremist individualism that cuts off how to care for the rest of the community comes in. So I would have liked to have more of that in the European culture and more discussions around what we can learn from particularly that in African culture.
Yes, but unfortunately that has been something that's not been embedded within the culture here in the United States, where growing up, it was multi-generational. I had my grandmother that lived in the same house as, it was my grandmother, my aunt, and my uncle, and then me, and my cousins. So you had 3 generations in the household all living together. There was no such thing as sending your elderly parents to a retirement home or to a nursing home. They lived with you. They cooked. They were very much part of what was happening. They got involved in your life. To my chagrin, my grandmother was very involved. Even when I got in trouble, she was the one that informed my uncle what was going on, and I was disciplined by him. And that's vitally important. And I think when we have the erosion of the family, we start to see moral decay in society. And that's what we're experiencing here in the United States. In a number of communities, lack of father figures, it impacts crime, education, economics. And that's where we're seeing kind of the decay here, particularly in Western thought or the United States.
That's something that we really notice, as I said, when we come to the United States and see the erosion of values here really. It seems to be like a hatred between the man and the woman. We've had a feminism that has kind of gone malicious on the man. Feminism is no longer an issue that's supposed to address the respect for the woman. Rather, it addresses and teaches us how to hate the man, it seems to generalize, of course. But I think this is also part of the problem that white America, let's say, has today. And this is why I wonder why many don't embrace, why we're not able to look at what's the good and bad in the Haitian culture, what's the good and bad in the white American, whatever, the British culture, what's the good and bad in African culture. If we could discuss that, we could be more intelligent in choosing, okay, so which values would we like to have in our societies?
Ignorance. We talk at each other rather than talking to each other and saying, well, let's establish the commonality. What are the things that we all want? And then working from there, it becomes partisan, whether it's politics, whether it's race, whether it's sex, where men are afraid of being men for fear of being perceived as being a chauvinist or anti-feminist, whereas not recognizing and saying, you are my equal, you're my partner in this, but I don't want to be misperceived as being, someone that I'm not, so I say nothing. And then you have situations where men are emasculated and they don't know how to function to be a leader in any capacity.
It is an issue, and when we become too focused on individualism, I think. Individualism is a wonderful thing because it gives us a lot of abilities, but when it becomes an extreme individualism,
yes.
That gives me the right to be selfish, and when it in society becomes socially acceptable to just think about yourself and disregard those you live with, you end up getting the war in the family.
Oh, absolutely, because that narcissistic view permeates throughout, where we've seen that many of the contributions, the people that have contributed to society, they depart from this view of where it's no longer individualistic, but it's collective. What can I do to impact the whole? In order to establish yourself as a change agent, you have to get to a point of self-awareness where you're no longer worried about what's good for me and my three, to use that adage, or what's good for just my family, but looking at it as how can I contribute to the whole? How can I make life better? And I think those ideals at one point were commonplace, but now they are sadly far more removed because everybody's more interested in taking a selfie, showing who I am, bragging on social media what I've done, rather than what can we do to change things.
I often come back to what the old ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle said, because when he attempted to define happiness, when a person is able to use his abilities to the benefit of society, then he will have a sense of happiness or a sense of, completion in his life. But I think what we've done in modern society, mostly really white America, to be quite honest, and the same goes for Europe, is that we've cut those two. We've said that happiness is to have a Coke and a smile, but it doesn't require anything to do what is good in society. It's what the old leftists used to speak about when they said solidarity. They were so correct in that.
Correct.
It's a value that we're forgetting.
Yes, it's a forgotten value because we have become consumers. It's a consumer mentality. It's disposable. It's what I can get, what I can take, and very little of what I can add. How can I improve things? How can I add value in whatever capacity that it is? For many individuals here in the United States, it's the ethos is no longer breaking barriers, establishing where you can create something lasting, where people can look back and take from you and provide, whether it's a mentorship or anything along those capacities, to what can I get? How can I satisfy me and my best life? You hear it, it's become commonplace where to speak your truth, not to speak the truth, but to speak my truth. And that is very flawed because we all know I can only draw from what my own ignorance to a large degree, rather than, truth is absolute. When we examine things, when we examine facts, we can look at it holistically rather than individually. And I think that's where it becomes problematic because it takes on, everything that we do. We always look at it as measured, how is it going to impact me, rather than how can it impact the whole. We see that happening in the Black community.
It's an issue, really, because when you look at the American society, especially, I would have to say, the amount of drugs you guys consume, it's unbelievable. 90% of all the poppy growing in Afghanistan after the United States came to that country. The poppy growing has grown immensely in Afghanistan, and to make heroin or whatever drugs they make from that under the Taliban. And I used to live in Brazil a few years back as well, and my goodness, all the drugs that came out of the favelas of Rio de Janeiro were shipped where? To the United States. It's a strange thing to me to see how the US seems to have lost completely the inner peace.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to address. I think personally that some of that comes from the fact that we don't think about each other anymore.
No, it's escapism. We're the import here from the United States is merely entertainment. It's very little intellectual capital where it once was. We were such a great nation because we produced en masse and then sent these products and services to the United States, where now it's centered on entertainment. What can we do to escape? We spend billions of dollars here in the United States on ways to entertain ourselves, whether it's Netflix, television, movies, etc., all in the hopes of somehow capturing a fleeting dream. A wise man said that all of it is folly. And it certainly is, because without purpose, you have no compass. There is no morality. There is no way to look at things critically and analyze things. You're merely just saying, I just want to keep myself occupied. Hence the drug problem. Hence, the opioid epidemic here in the United States is astronomical. And all because people are seeking an escape from real life.
In Europe, we tend to notice too, I was pointing out in the beginning here about CNN. I mean, it's an amazing worldview that probably fits the scene here in US. I don't know what the American people, do they really believe what they say there?
Some people do. There is a narrative that has been spoken and discussed numerous times by the president that CNN is fake news. It's very one-sided. And much of the media here, depending on what you read, there is an agenda. There's always an agenda being pushed onto the people, whereas very few people will look at it objectively and look at both sides. It's once been said that when you look at a lie, there's always a measure of truth in that. And very few people here in the United States will look at things objectively and say, well, where is the real truth in that? How can I find out more? Regardless of what the story is. We just take it hook, line, and sinker, as they say here in the United States, where we just watch something and we say, well, that has to be it. We've entrusted everyone, the media, to report to us what we would like to hear. Hence the partisanship, where certain media will report certain things, and even how the President of the United States is perceived.
I think that would be one of the big issues in our time too, is the deterioration of the neutrality of the media and the partisan way that news and world happenings are now being portrayed in the media. And it's a serious issue that speaks for an authoritarianism entering the stage that people really should be aware of. And also, when you look at the Hollywood industry, for example, I'm appalled, to be honest. I live in the Middle East. I'm appalled at the lack of respect for Middle Eastern peoples. When Americans make movies, for example, it's as though the movies are made to satisfy the agenda of the CIA in a certain country. My annoyment is that the media itself and Hollywood highly contributes to the growing hatred among people in the world. Why do they choose such a strategy?
Because you can affect the masses. With the media, you can virtually inflict propaganda, and it will sway thought. And that's why we look at things objectively. If we ask ourselves the critical questions, when you look at Hollywood throughout the years, different groups were vilified, where they would perpetuate a stereotype, and then that stereotype becomes truth. And that becomes problematic, where any group has become vilified. If we look at the history of Hollywood, you look at any marginalized group, for many years it was stereotyped, and then people begin to believe the lie instead of asking the questions. And then time will change, and we'll see a shift, and we'll find a new group that may be marginalized, and then they become vilified. And I think now what we're seeing is that in the Middle East, Arab culture is now, here in the United States, is public enemy number one. Anything, even contributions from the Arab community, is deemed unacceptable. But we don't ask ourselves the questions and say, well, without the Arabs, without the Muslims, we would never have algebra. Certain things that we use daily, the contributions from that society was a great, it impacted us in a powerful and profound way.
I do agree with you. I think that there's a lot of ignorance within the American people, really, and that makes them susceptible to the propaganda that is pushed out in newspapers such as New York Times and Washington Post, and most of the syndicated news in the US, over 90% of the American media is now owned by 6 corporations or less.
Yes.
And I know that I came from Doha, Qatar, coming here to Miami now, all over the Far East, in Singapore, Hong Kong, Beijing, China. I travel a lot, so I've been all over those places. The airports are 10 times or 20 times better than the American ones. Once you come here, you feel as though you're entering a movie from the 1970s. And when you go to New York, maybe the 1940s.
Yes.
The countries we portray in Hollywood as the poor, dusty places, that's not true at all. Actually, the poverty is in the United States now.
Yes. Intellectual poverty, fiscal poverty. There's a lot of things. To your point about the airports, the infrastructure here is lacking. Where we see just 30 years ago, where the United States was a leader and there was sound infrastructure. Here there's decay. The roads are not where they are supposed to be. Traffic bottlenecking in some cities because they never anticipated the growth, which is very interesting because how could we have not thought that there would be explosion in a major cities of populations?
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, Mr. Woodley Auguste, and we'll be speaking with you in further programs too, where you'll be sharing your most interesting analysis on the American culture.
Yes, thank you for having me.